Welcome to All Access, where we meet at the intersection of healthcare and generic and biosimilar medications. Brought to you by the Association for Accessible Medicines, representing the generics and biosimilars industry. Hello and welcome to All Access. I'm Dan Leonard, and today we're going to be talking about drug shortages. What is a shortage? What is the government, the FDA, doing about shortages? What is the drug industry doing to mitigate shortages? Do we have reasons to worry about drug shortages? It's a critical topic. It's an important topic, and we have a very good program today to discuss the intricacies, frankly, of drug shortages. They can be complex. It's a multifaceted issue that requires a thoughtful and strategic response. So today I'm very pleased to be joined by three experts who will help us navigate this topic and examine the causes and some potential cures for drug shortages. So with me today, first my colleague, David Gaugh. David is the Senior Vice President for Science and Regulatory Affairs here at the Association for Accessible Medicines. He is a registered pharmacist with more than 25 years of experience in the pharmaceutical sector and is a leader of our organization here at AAM. Jessica Daly is a pharmacist as well, with 2 decades in industry. She currently serves as the Chief Pharmacy Officer and Group Vice President of Supply Chain for Premier. Premier is one of the nation's leading and largest healthcare improvement companies, serving approximately 4,400 hospitals and more than 225,000 other providers and organizations. And Steven Schondelmeyer, also a pharmacist, 3 against 1 today with the pharmacist community, but Steven is a professor of pharmaceutical management and economics at the University of Minnesota, where he also serves as co-principal investigator for the Resilient Drug Supply Project in the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy. Steve also is director of the Prime Institute, which focuses on research and policy issues related to the pharmaceutical market. So welcome to each of you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, it's great to have this crew here today to talk about this important issue. I'm going to start with David. First of all, let's just go back up and go to the basics, David. Explain to the audience, what is a drug shortage? Is it when your pharmacist at the counter says, sorry, we don't have your medicine in stock, come back tomorrow? Is that a shortage, or is that way too simplistic to think about it that way?
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. I'm very happy to be here with my 2 colleagues and you, Dan. So to answer your question, we follow the FDA definition of shortages. There are 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 different definitions floating around in the United States of what is a drug shortage, but we specifically follow the FDA, which is a situation in which the total supply of all clinically interchangeable versions of an FDA approved regulated drug are inadequate to meet the current projected levels. So basically, think of it about a national shortage. There's nowhere in the United States you can get that drug. That is a drug shortage. It does not mean a situation where a pharmacy doesn't have enough medication on its shelf to fill a prescription when a patient walks in. That's really more of an out of stock situation. And that happens quite frequently. I go way back in my days of actually being a pharmacist and practicing pharmacy. There were out of stock situations like that happened frequently. You just didn't order enough, didn't anticipate patients coming in, but you can get it from the distributor the next day and everything is good. So really, you're looking at an out of stock situation versus an actual national drug shortage.
Well, thank you. So that's the baseline definition we're talking about at a national level, not your individual pharmacy on the corner. That makes a lot of sense. Let's back up in time just a little bit, a couple of years, of course. We entered a pandemic situation, a global pandemic, and the concerns, very real concerns, were around almost catastrophic shortage situations. There were projections of particular shortages of critical medicines during the pandemic. I think, well, we'll hear what you all think about how we netted out during the pandemic around that score, but I think we've done reasonably well. But the last 2 years have been very challenging. Were there nationwide or regional or global shortages during the pandemic?
I think we need to remember that the pandemic started with a few hotspots in the US in a handful of states. States like Washington, New York, New Jersey, California, and Florida had spikes of infections early, but the rest of the country was relatively quiet and unaffected for a period of time. And hospitals in these hotspot states did have initial shortages with dramatic increases in demand. We saw demand increases anywhere from 5-fold to as much as 40-fold increases in demand in specific locations and hospitals. When faced with a shortage, the health providers, the pharmacists, physicians, nurses that were practicing in those facilities scrambled to find alternative drug products to treat their patients with. And this added a lot of workload, a lot of time, a lot of cost for the health systems involved. And the drug supplies did get tight in those areas. But fortunately, the manufacturers and the wholesalers were able to step up and shift as we had more demand in Washington or California or New York. The wholesalers and manufacturers were able to shift some of their supply from the Midwest or regions that were less affected to those regions that were more affected. So we were able to mitigate some of the initial demand spikes by allocating and shifting product across regions in the US. What we have learned is that given time, 1, 2, 3 years, the market for pharmaceuticals can adjust, and it has adjusted in the last 2 years. One, we've seen health providers learn which drugs are more effective than others and how to use them more effectively so that their need for drug is a little bit less because they are only using drug for effective patients in effective ways. Second, there has been some increase in the amount of production of pharmaceuticals by various manufacturers who said, we can, if we can order in the supplies, if we can get the active pharmaceutical ingredient, we can dedicate our lines to producing the drugs most needed and increase supply a little bit. And that took a few months to a year or two to kick in. And then there were some new manufacturers that have announced or actually entered the market in the last 2 years finally. And they have entered the market both onshore in the US as well as in other countries, and particularly in nearshore countries, countries like Canada or Mexico, where they're entering the market. The point to keep in mind here is in the long run, the supply chain has been very resilient. In the short run, we do have to remember pharmaceuticals are different than other commodities and goods and services. For example, the PPE, the mask, companies were able to set up production and begin producing masks in 3 or 4 weeks. You can't do that for a new pharmaceutical that's needed. There's a longer lead time that's in the order of 6 months to 2 years even to get production and new facilities up and running. So pharmaceuticals have longer lead times than other industries, but given the constraints we've had, I think we did very well, and we were fortunate to have the pandemic roll out across states one at a time instead of all at once in the US.
You mentioned the resiliency of the supply chain, Steve. What about the importance of redundancy and having multiple points of manufacture? How important is that?
Sure. I mean, one aspect of resilience is redundancy. In other words, having slack resources that you can put into play quickly that can increase demand quickly. And we did see resilience. We did see redundancy. We have some redundancy in the market at present, but I think we've gotten a bit thin on the redundancy. Most manufacturers, most wholesalers, even most large hospitals and chains have learned to narrow down their inventory. One of the quickest ways to lose money in any industry is to have too much money sitting around in inventory. So they've narrowed down and tightened up their inventory on hand supplies. And we've learned that when facing a pandemic, you may need a little bit more inventory on hand. You may think you have a 30-day supply of drugs sitting in your supply room, but if the demand increases tenfold, that 30-day supply of drugs becomes a 3-day supply of drugs. Then you're in trouble. So we have to learn that we need redundancy in terms of manufacturers. We need redundancy in terms of wholesaler and stocks available in the supply chain. And we need redundancy in terms, at least for critical drugs, of supply held by large health systems and large pharmacy systems so that they can buffer or deal with some of these spikes that may occur unexpectedly in the marketplace.
So let's look back, take the pandemic out of the equation now and go back even further. 10 years, Steve, where were we 10 years ago on this topic of shortages versus where we are today? Are we in a better place, or is it more difficult, more challenging?
Well, in some ways we're in a better place. As was mentioned earlier, back in the 2000s, we had more than 200 drug shortages at any point in time. In the last decade, that has come down a little, but leveled out at about 150 to 170 drug shortages at any point in time. So we've improved a little, but we have not eliminated drug shortages. Drug shortages have been with us for well over 25 or 30 years and have been persistent in the US healthcare system. So we've at least stabilized so that the number of shortages aren't growing, but we haven't eliminated shortages. And shortages have occurred for a number of reasons. And I think the reasons are changing over time. There was a time in the late 2000s and well into the 2010s and the current decade that a lot of the drug shortages were sterile injectables. These were products that were used largely in hospitalized patients. They were largely older generic products that were off patent, and there were only a few manufacturers left in the marketplace. And those few manufacturers, if they had a equipment breakdown or they dropped out of the market for some reason, then we had shortages in the market. We're a little bit better off than we were 10 years ago, but we haven't solved the problem of drug shortages. And we need to view it as an unacceptable condition even today, and do what we can as industry, as government, as policymakers to work together to help address these problems and to eliminate drug shortages.
Yeah. Well, David, let's go back to you and on this theme as to where the pinch points are that cause shortages, and we represent the manufacturers. So are the manufacturers to be blamed for shortages, or are there other impacts in the system that cause these shortages?
Great question, Dan, and some of it's already been discussed by Steve and Jessica, but this is a very complex situation, and the causes are really multifaceted, which is why we're still here today discussing this 10 years after the peak that happened in 2009, 2010. And I can remember in 2010 being called, I worked for a generic company at the time, being called to Washington, D.C. We're going to have an 8-hour meeting. We were getting all the brains in the room. We're going to get this solved. So when we go home, we can put them in place and drug shortages will go away. Well, as I just said, 10 years later, we're still discussing it, and it's still a major issue for us. And I wish we could find the golden bullet, if you will, to resolve today. But it's not going to happen today. We just need to keep working on it. But to your point, Dan, it's everything from insufficient supply of raw materials. Jessica talked a little bit about component parts that we can't get right now. That's another piece of it. Another one is unpredictable change in product volume. In the brand world, you're the only company making that product. You own 100% of the market. You know your market. In the generic world, there are multiple companies making it, and that market shift can occur basically overnight. You could have 30%, and Steve kind of addressed this a minute ago, but you can have 30% one day, and it could spike to 60% the next day, or vice versa. And so those changes are a major cause of it. Problems associated with manufacturing. You mentioned manufacturing. Absolutely, there are issues with lines breaking down, with quality issues, recalls, as Steve mentioned earlier. So manufacturers, of course, play a key role in this. There's also inadequate communications, and I'll come back to that in just a second. But another one is hoarding. A lot of people don't really talk about hoarding, but hoarding becomes a major issue when things happen, like as Steve talked about, the pandemic being very regional based for the United States in the beginning. That's true, but people did start hoarding the products because their concern was COVID's coming here next. So that just exacerbates the whole issue. But I think one of the major things we did learn from back in 2009 and 10 was ultimately in 2012 under Fda, in that legislation that was put into place, there was a requirement in there that the manufacturers must contact the FDA the minute they know that they're having a drug shortage. Actually, the language says 6 months ahead, but we put in or as soon as possible because you don't know 6 months ahead necessarily. But by doing that, we're informing the FDA that we as a company are having an issue manufacturing a product. That puts the drug shortage staff or the DSS of the FDA kind of in action, if you will, calling the other companies that make that same product and working with those companies to try to alleviate any drug shortage. And it really has worked. As we said earlier, we've gone from in the high 250s, 270s down to just above 100. Unfortunately, still the same products are in that 100. But the FDA in 2019 was able to prevent 150 drug shortages. And then in 2020, 199 because of this early communication, early warning, and being able to work with other companies. So we've got some systems in place. We've got a lot more to do.
Yeah. Well, there's a silver lining in there. It's not perfect, certainly, but that's, to catch that many potential shortages and avert them. That's certainly a good thing. Jessica, at Premier, you study these issues quite a bit, and you recently released a white paper on the topic after surveying a number of your health system pharmacy partners and provider groups. What are some of the findings around this topic that came out of that work?
Thanks for the question, Dan. We surveyed more than 150 health systems, pharmacists, and staff, as well as more than 56 generic drug manufacturers, because from a Premier perspective, solving this challenge is not going to be a single-threaded solution. One part of the market can't find a way to reach a solution. We all have to work together. So it's a combination of GPOs, suppliers, providers, wholesalers. Everyone needs to pitch in. And so we really wanted to understand for all of our partners in the market, how do they view shortages? And certainly, I think it's no surprise that the majority of our health system pharmacy leaders, almost 100%, including their frontline staff, have been impacted by shortages. So it's something that everyone is experiencing. I think what was interesting is that the providers that we surveyed said that confidence in supply availability is one of their highest, most important factors in their purchasing strategy, which seems interesting when we think at the way that especially the generic market has moved over the years, being extremely price sensitive and looking at how we find and source products that are at a very competitive price. And that leads generally a lot of the decisions that are made. What was really, I think, really helpful from the survey is understanding more from the generic suppliers' perspective. What can we better do to mitigate shortages according to suppliers? And the survey really elucidated for us that from the drug manufacturers, it's unpredictable volumes, purchasing volume, purchasing demand that ranks as the top challenge for consistently supplying the market. And our suppliers said they really wish that health systems better understood that is important in helping to mitigate or prevent drug shortages. So participating in high commitment programs really emerged as the #1 opportunity for our suppliers to best protect the market from shortages. And so there's certainly a focus on redundancy in raw material, safety stock, manufacturing. That's a key part of what we're looking at, but it's really that steady demand signal from the market that was critically important. And so when we look at how Premier plays in this space, we've certainly seen over our decades and focus around drug shortage and trying to eliminate drug shortages that we need to find better ways for our suppliers, certainly decrease barriers to entry, decrease the cost to enter the market. We've worked very closely with suppliers over the years to bring them back to the market, and especially in the injectable space, having multiple suppliers either re-enter or newly enter the market to support high-risk injectable products. But the most important thing that we've seen, and we've been able to model this out with some of our programs, high compliance is critically important. And high compliance doesn't always come with the lowest price tag. We focus our strategy around bringing high quality, reliable supply for both our providers and our suppliers, at a price that is fair. That's the most important thing. Lowest pricing is not going to get you the redundancy and the stability in the supply chain that our members are looking for. It's that fair, stable price that comes along with high quality and resiliency. And so that's really something interesting that we found from the survey. And it's something that we continue to work on. We continue to build programs that focus on pulling together our stakeholders, our suppliers, our providers, our wholesalers, and certainly Premier as an aggregator of that provider volume to align around those high compliance, predictable demand types of models so that we can better stabilize the market. And I think we've shown that we've had some success in that area. But to David's point, a pandemic is going to be the test of that no matter which way you look at this, right? We can have the best demand signaling in the market. And when there is a pandemic and you've got health systems and providers around the country that are tasked with ensuring continuity of care for patients. And I speak as someone who at the beginning of the pandemic was sitting in a provider organization running pharmacy supply chain. It is absolutely terrifying to know that there could be shortages coming. You don't know when they're coming, you know that they're coming. And so there's other things that I think we can be doing from a data and transparency perspective. We certainly are lacking in some of the important information that would help make this easier. Certainly we've got a compliance program we're going to manufacture and produce and consume at a certain level in normal times. But it's very hard for us to know, and it's hard for us to make decisions on purchases when we don't always know about overall supply levels that exist across the country. What's the burn rate of a product? So if you're sitting in Pittsburgh and you see New York or Florida or California being hit by a COVID wave, what is their burn rate? If I start to see patients coming into my ICUs and my emergency departments in the next few weeks or months, how much product will I need? Do we have any idea about real-time demand or distribution capacity in the market? These are all blind spots that until we solve for them, we can put a lot of really strong solutions together and programs that align around high compliance or align around predictable demand. But we need to be able to prepare for some of those other areas where predictability and demand isn't going to be the final solution. We have to have additional visibility and transparency into what the market looks like. And we found that our generic suppliers have been wonderful in working with us to better understand market dynamics, upstream supply challenges, manufacturing capacity and capabilities, some more of that downstream visibility into where supply sits across the country, how quickly we can move it, burn rates, demand, and changing clinical needs, I think will be very important as we work together to find a sustainable solution for the future.
So Steve, we've talked a lot about the supply chain, the upstream supply chain, but talk to us about the dynamics in the marketplace where you have highly commoditized industry with generic manufacturers, where you may have 6, 10, 12, 20 manufacturers selling into a smaller group of purchasers who have significant buying power, and what kind of impacts can that have on the supply of pharmaceuticals?
Great question. And I think one particularly prominent form of what I would call an economic failure in the market can be characterized as over-competition. That's when we have older, well-established, lower-priced generic products in the marketplace whose price has been pushed down and down and down. Some of these older, well-established products, like the sterile injectables we've talked about that are used in hospitals, have a relatively low price to begin with because they're old and they didn't start at the high prices like we see new products today. And as large hospitals and buying systems consolidated and there were fewer buyers, they begin to press the competition more and more and to encourage lower prices from the generic injectable producers. And that low price at some point became insufficient for many manufacturers in terms of margin to even remain in the market. So we need to develop a market that can factor in not only what's the lowest price for the product, but what is a stable supply. And as Jessica described earlier, what is a reasonable and affordable price for these drugs? And so we need to make changes both in our buyers and in our manufacturers of how those prices are determined and set in the marketplace. And they need to factor in not only low price, but quality and sufficient price to maintain appropriate equipment and manufacturing facilities and even redundancy in the market, so we don't face the shortages like we've seen in the last 2 decades.
And Jessica used the word fair, which is, I think, an aspiration for all of us. Did you want to jump in on that, Jessica?
Well, I do want to just jump in really quickly and agree wholeheartedly with Steve's comments about over competition in the market. So we've looked at our data, and we're monitoring very closely as part of our work as a GPO. We review every generic manufacturer, every product in the market, and we are looking for a healthy market. And when we make our contract awards, it is certainly more than just price. And we are not always, and we tell our members this, we are not always the lowest price on every product, but we take in so many different factors into consideration. And one of the areas that we have seen, and our data has shown this, and it's exactly what Steve said, is you certainly see challenges where there's only 1 or 2 suppliers in the market. If there's any kind of a disruption, immediately you have a shortage because the market can't recover. But we constantly see those products where there are over competition, too many suppliers that are driving the price too low, that causes many suppliers to exit the market, so that you end up with a situation where you only have 1 or 2 suppliers left. And then it causes a rebound sometimes of increased shortages. The market can't respond because the market was built on a supply chain of 10 to 14 suppliers. Now, if there's only 1, 2, or even 3 or 4 left that are trying to manufacture the capacity that 14 were manufacturing before, it can't be done. And so we see a yo-yo of these over competition events where suppliers exit the market, prices go up. Once prices go up, manufacturers want to come back in and try and capitalize on higher prices. We start to see that over competition again, and we see a yo-yo effect of those areas. And so we really do encourage, and we work closely with our suppliers to find the right balance. What we looked at in our data is a balance is about 3 suppliers in any given market is a really good number for the market. It helps to protect. So if there are any disruptions, we can more easily compensate and shift across the market. It doesn't create an over competition situation where we have prices that are constantly being compressed, but we're able to best support the market so that 3 suppliers. And certainly we also layer in the idea of diversity of supply. So they're coming, the raw material, the products are being manufactured in diverse areas across the globe. Maybe it's onshore, nearshore, maybe it's other areas, but having that diversity and location that those products are coming from further supports that strategy of having a really healthy number of suppliers that can shift and respond to market changes. But we're not seeing that yo-yo effect of over competition. So Steve, I think you're absolutely right there.
Well, while that's to your case on over competition has been taking place, we've been in a period, quite frankly, of hyper consolidation on the buyer side. Not talking specifically about the GPOs market, but all of the customers from our sector, where there used to be 10 buyers, then 5, and now 3. That has impacts too, right, Steve?
It does. And as I said earlier, both the buyers and the sellers have been consolidating. They're fewer on both sides. But I think also, in addition to what Jessica described, that there's a need for a minimum number of suppliers in the market to maintain that competition. I think there are some products in the pharmaceutical market space that have very low demand. Not many people need them. And they may not have enough demand to support even one manufacturer in the market. And we need to recognize that for critical drugs that have very low demand. I think there is such a thing as a public good that we may need to develop a process to provide support or subsidy for certain manufacturers to make those products, much like we do in the agricultural space for certain types of agricultural goods or products. There may be a need for government identification and support of certain critical small volume products that are essential to the public healthcare system.
So let's zoom back out to the kind of more the upstream supply chain issues that impact here. And David, speak to us a little bit about the blueprint that AAM has published and worked on with our members for many years, and the components of the blueprint that could help alleviate shortages in the future?
Thanks, Dan. And we've talked about it a little bit already. I mean, just the fact of where do we want these factories built? And as Steve said early on, we can't onshore everything into the United States, because what if all those factories had been in New York, New Jersey, and Washington? They would have ultimately been shut down. Now, that didn't happen, of course, and we don't want that to happen, but it's a possibility. So, near shoring, as you said, Canada, Mexico, but by the same token, our industry, both brand and generic, are very global industries. And where do those companies typically build their facilities? They start out in their backyards, if you will. Now, of course, they've grown and merged and expanded, and so they're all over the globe. But to Dan's point, we pulled together actually before the pandemic even started, when Made in America was coming around in late 2019. We started working on a white paper that we call the blueprint, and the blueprint is about what it would take to bring everything back to the United States. And it would take a significant investment on the government's part, both on the front end to help us get those facilities moved or rebuilt, if you will, from whatever country they're in to the United States, but also on the back end. Not every company is going to move to the United States. So you're still going to have competition in the marketplace, making products specifically in the United States at a maybe higher cost point than another company that's doing it in a lower cost point. And so you have that kind of reverse incentive, if you will. You made it here, you asked us to do this, but now we're back in the ballpark of competing in the market. So we have to have those incentives really on both ends to do that. But again, most importantly, it needs to be a global supply chain. And that's what we found in the blueprint. And I would say just one more thing about that. America was not the only country that said, build it here. Europe was saying that, Australia was saying that, Japan was saying that. And no company, pharmaceutical or otherwise, can afford to have quadruple redundancies. We do want to have redundancies, as Steve said earlier on, so we don't get into shortages, but you can't have quadruple redundancies. And so more made in America, absolutely. And we're also doing a survey right now that we are finding that we have a significant amount of production in the US today and excess capacity within many of those facilities that aren't being utilized. And so we need to have a better understanding of that, and we're reviewing that right now with our members.
All right. Well, so we've really covered the waterfront of this topic. So here's the kind of the exit question for all three of you as we wrap up. Give us some prescription for success, prescription for how we can improve the situation, and ultimately the goal being to alleviate shortages in the future. So Jessica, I'm going to start with you. What would be some longer term proposed solutions that you would put out there to prevent shortages going forward?
Sure. So I think we have seen within our own programs significant success, as I've talked about before, in creating high compliance, predictable demand partnerships between our providers, suppliers, wholesalers, and the GPO. That has been extremely valuable. To David's point about excess capacity, we've also seen extreme success in investing in existing capacity for manufacturing here in the United States. So investing in suppliers that are manufacturing products here that again combines with that high compliance, highly committed demand model that we've built has been extremely successful. So for the future, I think what we would recommend from a Premier perspective is more of that. More predictability and demand, partnerships across the organization and industry, leveraging that existing capacity that does exist already here in the United States for manufacture. We know it's here. We've worked with suppliers to bring that capacity online for our members. The more we can do that and really leverage that existing capacity, we think is going to be extremely helpful. We also want to, again, continue to focus on that fair price. It's not always the lowest price, but price needs to be taken in context with the overall quality and supply resiliency of the product that we're bringing into the market. So it's really going to be a multi-stakeholder effort for everyone involved, from the provider who, as we've seen in some recent data, providers their operating expenses are going to continue to be constricted. And so we know that cost is important. So the provider has to be a part of this discussion to land on good, transparent, fair pricing in the market and committed demand. So bringing the provider, bringing suppliers who have done a lot of work in support of increasing transparency, working certainly with Premier to better understand all of the needs and challenges and frankly opportunities that exist in the upstream supply chain has been incredibly valuable. So more partnership and collaboration there, and then continued partnership and collaboration with our wholesale channel to make sure that there is access to these products. Again, it's a multi-stakeholder event, really moving beyond just pricing and building a market that looks at transparency, resiliency, and quality as we leverage the existing capacity that we have.
Steve, you're up. Prescriptions for or solutions for this issue?
David said earlier, there's no golden bullet that will take care of this in one shot. This is a multifaceted issue that we have to deal with. We need to deal with the affordability of the drug supply. We need to deal with the safety of the drug supply. And as I've studied this market over the last 5 or 6 years, I've actually studied pharmaceuticals for 45 years. But the major blind spots we have, I think, are in the upstream supply chain. Policymakers need to understand that upstream supply chain, because no single manufacturer, no single wholesaler, no single GPO, no single health system can solve the drug shortage problem by their own data and with their own intelligence. They have to collaborate, and someone has to have a view of the system as a whole to know when all of our antibiotic of a certain type is coming from one country. One manufacturer might know their antibiotic comes from that country, but they don't know where other suppliers necessarily are getting that antibiotic. So we need someone in the US who understands from a policy standpoint where that upstream supply chain is and where there are bottlenecks that are likely to cause us problems.
All right, so David, you get to bring us home. Any final quick thoughts on solutions or where we should be looking on this topic going forward?
If you look back at the pandemic and when that first started, how did we get all these things resolved so quickly that Steve talked about moving product from one region to another? It was the federal government that pulled us all together, manufacturers, GPOs, distributors, etc., and we were able to identify those problems and quickly move them. It took a Department of Justice to step in on some of that, but that happened, and it happened quickly. FDA also has a responsibility here. Steve was talking about the approval process on certain things. If we run out of glass vials that are approved for our product and need to switch to another, that takes time with the FDA. There should be an expedited process to get something like that accomplished quickly, or a drug and shortage and we have an application that's being reviewed to get that expedited and moved quickly as well. So I think we have to leverage some of the activities of the federal government to help us get where we need to get to. I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's a great place to stop. This has been a fascinating conversation and on an important topic. I'd like to thank Jessica Daly, Steve Schondelmeyer, and David Gaugh for participating today in our podcast, All Access, on the issue of drug shortages. So thanks to all three of you.
Thank you, Dan.
Dude.
Thanks. And we'll see everyone next time on All Access.